Hello and welcome to Rule of Carnage. This is one of those videos that you might also be listening to with your ears. And we are going to spend some time talking about designing better miniature games. And we're going to spend what Glenn believes will only be 30 minutes talking about some inalienable truths of miniature game design. What are the things that will always be true, the rules that always exist, the factors that must be present when you're designing a miniature game? There might not be any, but we're going to see if there are some and see if we can find any disprovals of the fact that there might be some inalienable truths. This is sort of the counterpoint to the rules that should not be, but always are. This is the rules that always will be. Amen.
Yeah, I think we're sort of fairly, I wouldn't say obsessed, but we're heavily interested in seeing if we can sort of do things in tabletop miniatures games that you probably shouldn't be able to do.
And also we're two massive nerds and therefore definitions matter, and we have been trying to define miniature games for nigh on 50 episodes of this 50 recordings of this podcast.
Yeah, and I think a while ago we were talking about, obviously, A Billion Suns plays across more than one tabletop. And early on within the A Billion Suns design system, there's trying to work out a way of doing the looping circular table. And we at least figured out how to let you play on a circular table or a hexagonal table or any shaped table you like. Then we were having a conversation about, well, can you play on any surface? Does it have to be a flat surface? And sure enough, somebody put A Billion Suns on the side of their fridge. So
using magnets. Yep.
So those seem to be like things you could definitely had to have with a tabletop miniatures game, in that you had to have a table with a top to play it, but apparently not. So I think we started wondering about what sorts of things you assume to be true, and there must be some of them. There must be some rules we can't break, possibly. And we're looking to try and figure out what some of those are. So obviously tables don't have to be a set size or a set number of tables,
right?
Do they have to be, some sort of set shape to them? I know that you can play A Billion Suns like on a round or hexagonal table, and you can play it on a breakfast bar and a chair, but are there some, there are some limitations to what sort of surface you can play A Billion Suns on?
No, I don't think so. Like Necromunda, for example, proves that the more three-dimensional a table, the better. And there's a game, I've forgotten the name of it right now, where they ran a Kickstarter, and it's a miniature skirmish game with a cube that's that's stuck together with magnets, and then you play your. It's like a kind of what's that thing? Ender's Game, like the sort of training routine that they do in the first half of Ender's Game, the sort of zero gravity fight out. So I think like both of those things, like a classic and a new, they prove that like part of the charm of these three-dimensional, fully rendered miniature environments is that you can have an incredible variety of spaces in which to play, and ups and downs. And quite a lot of miniature games don't actually deal with the third dimension in any meaningful way. They abstract it or what have you. But I think that once you are excited by the idea of three-dimensionality, and you are excited by the idea of objectives or deployment zones which are relative to points on the table rather than relative to edges of the table, then I think you eliminate any need for size, space, shape, edges, spherical thing. Like, it doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah, and absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think that I suppose the question about whether there needs to be a tabletop and the tabletop needs to be a given shape is ultimately a question about whether or not you can balance a miniature on it, and if you can magnetize miniatures to other things. And then the other big question,
and that's frankly a convenience more than anything. Like, we've both played plenty of games where we go, yeah, the goblin is, we know he's just there, I can't get him to stand, but if you like, I'll put this dice to show where he is and we'll measure from that.
Absolutely. And I suppose if we're going for the big ones right off the bat, in relation to a tabletop miniatures game, given that you don't need a tabletop, the next question is, do you actually need miniatures? Given that if you're abstracting a lot of the miniatures down to bases or positions or even points, you know, in the case of Billion Suns, everything is abstracted down to a single point.
So I will fight you with knives on this point that yes, you have to have miniatures. And unfortunately, I will lose this knife fight to many people, including you, who will happily play miniature games without miniatures because people will play Billion Suns because it's more convenient, or people will play travel versions of games. I myself have play tested Hobgoblin with little cardboard squares because I just needed to like tear a game out really fast. But I think it isn't a tabletop miniature game if it doesn't have any miniatures in it. And I sort of don't mean if you play a game without miniatures in, you are not playing a miniatures game. But if you design a miniatures game without miniatures in mind, then I think you are doing something else, because you're not joining all of the elements together that in my mind are inalienably part of this medium that I enjoy.
So, I mean, I was thinking about this the other day, and I was thinking about, so for example, in Infinity, they have their sort of soup can silhouette from when you're doing shooting. And if you think about a game like Infinity, what that means is that there's the version of the tabletop you look at. And what that actually is it's a sort of filigree facade over the matrix-like reality of that tabletop. And
yeah, it's like hitboxes. It's like hitboxes in video games. Like the sprites can do whatever they want, but the hitbox is the thing that matters.
Yeah, and so in you know, does Infinity need on any the miniatures for Infinity are just a thing to put there to look pretty until you try and actually figure out how the game works, and then you may throw that mini in the bin and put a soup.
Yeah, but if you take the minis away from Infinity, it just isn't that game. Like a game is not a set of mechanics that interact on the tabletop. A miniature game at its best is a holistic fantasy experience. It's an enveloping experience that contains both the fantasy that you wish to inhabit and that you want to be part of and you want to be firing in your brain, plus the challenge of engaging with the gamic system, with the social interactions across the table. Like, you know, I mean, with the exception of solo games, I was wondering, like, if you take any of those things away, it's definitely less of a game. Does it cease to become its own? Does it cease to become something that is of that medium? I'm not sure. But like, if you took all of the miniatures away from Infinity, it wouldn't tell the same story. It wouldn't have the same flavor on the palate. It wouldn't tell the same stories.
I mean, this is the thing. I can agree that it would have a different feel to it. But only in the way that it would have a different feel to it if I wrote a different setting for it and replaced the miniatures with a sort of set of fantasy miniatures or something of that nature. I don't think it would cease to be that sort of a game. It would just be that sort of a game that had a very different sort of flavor level to it. So the flavor level to it would be bland, rice cakes, because you'd just be playing with transparent soup cans. But I don't think that flavor being beige changes what the game is.
Perhaps what we're wondering about is like where the boundaries of a miniature lies, because if you tried to play A Billion Suns remembering where all of the ships were without any markers, that clearly wouldn't work. You can use cardboard chits as markers, and if they have little pictures of spaceships on, all the better. One thing that's interesting is I've been researching naval war games. One thing that I've read a couple of times was people say of 1/6,000th scale miniatures, which are teeny tiny little things. I bought a couple of them to have a little look at what they were like. At that scale, people start to say things. I read a couple of times, people said, well, at this point, you may as well just play on a large sheet of like brown packing paper and just mark off the location of the ships with a pencil and then rub them out and then redraw where they are, so that you can sort of imagine like playing in a sort of massive whiteboard sort of situation, like recording the location of the ships as if they were on some kind of, kind of war room wall. And so at that point, like, is that one of these games? Like the miniature at that point is a pencil drawing that evolves.
I mean, I personally, I think that they are this kind of game. I think that, I mean, personally, I'm repeatedly mildly obsessed with trying to create a certain rule somewhere in a game which actually makes it a necessity to have a physical miniature. And it's just, it only has to be one or another, but I like there to be a thing which is like, you can fit through a doorway if the miniature can go through the door without its head coming off, or something of that nature. Just one thing that says, yeah, at one point in this game, you are going to need to care about the shape of the actual physical miniature, because it's going to make you do something with it just once, just so it's one of the things I do like about we mostly play Gaslands without bases, and the thing I like about Gaslands without bases is that it totally matters how long your car is, and it totally matters if you picked up a Mini or some great long Chevy or something, and it's only a little thing, but it changes the gaming experience. It changes.
That's interesting, actually. So that's interesting, because actually that suggests that having miniatures in war games from a rules perspective is the aberration, and the abstraction is the non-aberration, because people get very crossed about like dark elf ships that have these very long pokey bits that allow you to measure from places that don't feel like you should be able to measure from, or the brief moment where Age of Sigmar didn't have bases, so you could just pile as many Skaven on top of each other as you wanted to. Like, what didn't matter was the miniature. What mattered was the abstraction of the base size. And actually, Ash Barker's game, Gamma Wolves, it phrases this very nicely. It says, when you make a mech, you choose the weight of the mech, and that determines the base size. And once you've got a 40 mil base, your job is to fill that up with mech. And that's all it says. It's like, do whatever the hell you want to make a cool thing that describes what's going on there, but like the only thing that matters is the 40 mil base.
Yeah, and it's really...
But I think, but it's really, really important to me, because like one of the questions that people can rightfully ask is, when you're dealing with a subject and you begin to explore it, you'd be like, is this best as a miniature game, or would this be better as a board game, or better as a card game? And in some regards, in some situations, my feeling is like the fact that it has miniatures is an input, not an output. Like, one of the things that I want to do is make an assassin game with miniatures, and those two things go into the design, and what comes out has to match those things. Whether I put in the word assassin and the word miniature, and the game design process produces this should be a board game about assassins, like, that's incorrect. That's a miscalibrated design process. So for me, because I've been wrestling with this for a naval game that I've been tinkering with, you keep asking, like, does this need miniatures? Like, it's the 6,000, it's the 1/6000 thing. Like, once you zoom out enough, does it need miniatures, or would it be better as a board game? And I keep looking at it and going, would this be better as a like cardboard chits sort of old style war game? And it's like, well, that's not important. Like, I want to play with miniatures. I myself want to play with little toy boats. So that's an input, not an output.
I mean, the irony, I think, for that, for the way that I feel more and more about tabletop miniatures games in relation to the fact that, you're looking at naval games, is that I do think miniatures on the tabletop are important. I just don't think that these miniatures on the tabletop are important. I think that the terrain is important. The terrain that blocks line of sight and blocks movement and slows movement. I think that, all of these little guys can be bases. I couldn't really, most of the time,
you can't see why they need to be giant monsters.
It doesn't particularly matter.
But like the giant church has to be a giant church, or it doesn't function.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, especially if I've got particularly an abstracted line of sight rather than true line of sight, I need to know.
Maybe that's it. All these years of railing against true line of sight, and that's the only true way of doing a miniatures game, because if it doesn't have true line of sight, what's the purpose in having a model?
Well, that's the thing. Even with abstracted line of sight, I need terrain models, but I don't necessarily, with abstracted line of sight, need need little
But with an
models.
abstracted terrain system, you also only need footprints of terrain. So
Well, no, if it's a three-dimensional, you can still have a base on top of a building. So it needs to be boxes, and I need boxes with holes in that I can push miniatures through and around. And at that point, you know what?
I've basically
I've got
made a little church. Yeah,
I've made a building. So that's a funny thing when you talk about naval games, is that I don't really think that I need soldiers on bases necessarily for most games, but I totally think that I need a building and a set of trees and a swamp and all these sorts of things. And then you're talking about a naval game, which is, well, what's the terrain? I don't know, there might be an iceberg and a push, and it's like, well, no, I just don't even know why in any level you need any kind of miniature. You need a blue roll of wallpaper, and then yeah, I'm totally fine with you drawing things on and rubbing them out again. So yeah, I mean, like I say, I don't think you need those miniatures, but I think you need a three-dimensional thing to put on a tabletop. And I'm very antsy about the idea of things like naval stuff, you know, and at least, you know, with spaceships you have asteroids and stuff, and I'm really personally very interested in things like space and air flight games that play with the three-dimensional nature of the actual minis. And again, talking about naval games, you showed us that one of the old naval games which suggested that you have tabletops as like islands, and you have the floor as the playing surface, and you put all of your boats on broomsticks, and then you can leave a few stools and stuff and ottomans around the room, and those are reefs, and therefore the ships can't go through those reefs. And then you push a ship from one island to another island, and then it lands soldiers onto that island. Now that is a naval game that I can totally get behind, and totally needs miniatures, and I think is absolute genius. Insane, possibly, but at least insane genius. So yeah, I'm not sure that miniatures games need miniatures. Mike at least does think that that is an inalienable truth of the genre.
Well, I mean, this is maybe me as a product person rather than as an abstract design first person, but like it's an incomplete experience.
No, I can understand that. I can understand that physically at the tabletop it's a better experience if you have minis, and I don't contest that.
It's whether or not the rule system is asking questions about those objects.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think that the minis are an inalienable truth of these
all games. So what is then? What else have we got on the list that might be?
Okay, I think a few of these games might, these rules might be asking questions about the nature of where these games need to be pickup games and need to be sort of open for people to come into. So whether or not you can do hidden movement with a tabletop miniatures game. Now, there are obviously tabletop miniatures games that do hidden movement. I think is it All Quiet on the Martian Front?
Yeah, that's my favorite example. So that one is an asymmetrical game where one person plays massive Martian tripods stomping around with heat rays, and the other person plays the humans with their little machine gun wielding World War I guys, and some tanks, but they're quite rubbish. And it deals you out little blip tokens, and so the humans are weak, but they get the opportunity of stealth, and I think it works pretty nicely.
Sure. So there's a couple of questions I think I'd raise on this one. Is if you had a game where you've got hidden movement, therefore everybody has blip tokens, and during a particular playthrough of that game, none of those blip tokens ever get revealed, so you never use a miniature, and if you hold that it is necessary for somebody to use a miniature on the tabletop for it to be one of these sorts of games, can you therefore have a game that is both one of these sorts of games and a hidden movement game, given that the hidden movement game can be played without miniatures, and the miniatures game can't be played without miniatures.
I mean, I would consider that design to be a failure, but if you're the sort of person who believes that it would be just fine to play with empty bases or beautifully illustrated colored tokens instead of units, then ultimately there isn't really any difference in playing with beautifully illustrated flat tank counters and this game that we're just hypothetically describing.
I just mean, it's like, if 9 times out of 10 that game does end up having a bunch of miniatures put onto the tabletop, because you almost always find each other, but it so happens that two forces come together who are both interested in playing the full stealth game, and you play out a full stealth.
But I also think that like the design, not to catapult into a hidden movement podcast episode, but like I think the design has to engage with the resolution from which it does very nicely in All Quiet on the Martian Front, the resolution from blip of unknown capability to unit with known capability that is probably stronger but more in one way or the other. And if you never reveal these miniatures, then I don't think your design is working, because it's not transporting like tension to payoff.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, I do agree with you then. I think that's the point to get to. I think the thing with hidden movement is that you need to note the movement upon the tabletop.
Yeah.
And with these sorts of games, that requires you to do something slightly weird and slightly not of this sort of game. So it's like, if you're playing Scotland Yard, a hidden movement game, plenty of the best games of Scotland Yard are one where you never find Mr. X, and that's totally fine because it has this very abstracted notation of movement, and he doesn't have to put a little token down and move it around on the board. That's literally what it's built and designed around. When you do hidden movement with a tabletop miniatures game, you've still got to put something onto the tabletop, because you can't note where a thing is in a tabletop miniatures game, because you'd literally need to measure out the entire table, draw out a millimeter by millimeter grid, and write down incredibly, specific positional notations. You still got to put something.
Sounds very satisfying.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. You still got to physically put something onto the tabletop. And so there's an interesting question as to, even in All Quiet on the Martian Front, how hidden is that hidden movement? Or is it just non-specific movement? Is it, I know you're in one of these 3 spots. In Scotland Yard or Fury of Dracula, I do not know where you are.
Nonsense. I know you're in one of 200 spaces. Or in the case of Dracula, I know you're in one of like 30 spaces. So imagine Perilous Tales with, instead of 8 threat counters, it has 30 threat counters. And maybe there's a way of finding out whether that threat counter is empty or has got one of the 8 monsters in it. There's still a discrete sort of knowable element.
I think that's a stretch to say. Am I playing hide and seek with every other person in the world because I don't currently know where they are? No, because we're not within the specified boundaries of a game of hide and seek. There has to be specified boundaries of the game. If
Glenn's coming to find you, by the way.
If you say, oh no, you do know where Dracula is because he's not anywhere in the entirety of the universe, it's like, oh no, I think that's a pretty fallacious argument at that point. I think the point is that with Dracula, with Dracula Fury of Dracula, with Mr. X in Scotland Yard, he could be in any of the spaces that a playing piece within that game is capable of being in, any one of them, right? With All Quiet on the Martian Front, the hidden movement pieces could not be in every single place that a miniature within that game could be in.
Yeah, not within the bounds of where within that game could be.
Yeah, they can only be in a very, very, very limited number of places that a miniature could be in that game. Like given the range of actual positions a miniature could occupy in the average tabletop miniatures game, the hidden movement minis in All Quiet on the Western Front are part of an insanely limited set of positions that you could be in, given that you've got like a borderline infinite number of positions and they can be in like 3 of them. That's such a small subset of the available positions. it barely qualifies as being hidden movement.
Yeah, I don't agree with that. Like in comparison to the analog movement, sure, but like that isn't necessarily a useful granularity with which to analyze that situation. Like once you know where Mr. X is on like the 7th turn or whatever, the 8th turn, like you then know for the next couple of turns he's within these sort of 12 different spots, and so you know he's in a radius around there, and the game has to give you that because that's the only way that it can make it feasible for you to get a bead on him. And so in a game, I can't remember the name of it, but one of the naval games that I've been reading, which has a submarine token, and the submarine token, there's some mechanic which means that the submarine can pop up anywhere within 6-inch sort of radius of that token. So that token describes an area within which the submarine is hidden. Like, I don't see that there's a vast amount of difference between defining an area of the table, whether that's 3 points or a 6-inch bubble, and the sort of 12 spaces in London that Mr. X could be after. Like, I still think it qualifies as having some of that tension of I need to make decisions in absence of complete information of where the units are, which I think is what, at least from a wargaming perspective, I think is what's the sort of interesting question that it's trying to put on the table. But I mean, obviously, I take the point. It's a far cry from a full hidden movement, but I do think that there's a lot that can be achieved to replicate that sort of hidden information.
Okay, I think we will finally sign off on this conversation. It went a touch longer than possibly anyone was expecting, but you know, these things happen.
If you're still here, thanks for sticking around.
If you're still here, you obviously think that what we're doing is of some worth or value, and you're a hero, and we love you deeply.
Get to the end of this video, and you ever see me in real life, let me know that I promise to buy you a beer, and I will buy you a beer wherever we are.
Please, if you watch this point, like and subscribe. Drop us a comment in the comment section. Do you think that there's something we said wasn't an inalienable truth that was? Is there something you think is inalienable to these games that we entirely missed out? Do you think that these games don't need to have some form of granular spatial relationship between models? If so, what on earth do you think the game that didn't have that would look like? I would love to get into that. If such a person exists,
battle chess.
Please.
It's battle chess, Glenn.
For now, we will definitely sign off on this episode of Rule of Carnage. It's been great fun. It's always fascinating getting into these very deep delve and somewhat philosophical subjects. Hopefully we'll come up with something a little bit more concrete and simple for the next conversation.
Yeah, we'll rate our favorite goblin miniatures in the next conversation.
For now, we're going to sign off from this episode of Rule of Carnage. So
bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye. Bye.